At her father's funeral, Margaret smirked, thinking she had won. She had stolen his fortune before he was even in the ground. But what she didn't know, she had taken the wrong box, and her downfall was just beginning. In the town of Willowbrook, a wealthy old man named Harold Lancaster passed away, leaving behind a fortune. His funeral was somber, filled with mourners who truly loved him, except for one. Among them was Margaret, his only daughter, standing near his casket with a smug grin. As she leaned toward her nephew James, she whispered, "I already emptied his safe deposit box. There's nothing left for you." Then she walked away, her designer dress swaying, her confidence unshaken. She thought she had won. Margaret had always been entitled. She married rich, divorced richer, and spent money like it would never run out. Her brothers, Thomas and Robert, were different. Thomas, James' father, had cared for Harold in his final years, handling his appointments, bills, and needs. Robert was distant, never causing trouble, never getting involved. But Margaret, she only showed up when there was something in it for her. As the funeral reception began, Harold's longtime lawyer, Mr. Callahan, approached James. The older man had a knowing smile as he said, "She took the wrong box." James's head snapped up. Callahan explained that Harold, knowing Margaret's nature, had prepared two safe deposit boxes, one real, one a decoy. The box she stole contained nothing but worthless papers and fake stock certificates. The real assets, however, were safely accounted for. Days later, Margaret was boasting about her newfound wealth, planning extravagant vacations and a new estate. But when she tried to cash in her stolen documents, she was met with a harsh reality. The stocks were fake, the bonds worthless. Furious, she screamed at her attorney, demanding answers. Meanwhile, James met with Callahan to review Harold's real legacy: a multi-million-dollar estate, an untouched trust, and most notably, a prime piece of land outside of Denver. Once seen as worthless, this land had been in development talks for years. Margaret's shock turned to fury. She called James, accusing him of tricking their grandfather into cutting her out. "You stole from me," she shrieked, but James simply reminded her, "You took the wrong box." Margaret was far from done. She filed a lawsuit against James, claiming he manipulated Harold into rewriting his will. She demanded the trust be overturned, the land seized, and everything redistributed. The case had no merit, but she still had just enough money to drag it out, filing motion after motion, delaying the inevitable. But while she was busy fighting James, something else was happening behind the scenes. Margaret had always lived beyond her means. After her divorce, she secretly spiraled into debt, maxing out credit lines, taking out private loans, and borrowing against every asset she had. Her legal battle with James only put a spotlight on her shaky finances. Soon, creditors started knocking. Then, the IRS took notice. And then came the real blow. Her ex-husband sued her, claiming she had hidden assets during their divorce. Her world was crumbling. Meanwhile, James finalized the land deal Harold had set up. A major development company had been negotiating for years, and the sale went through just as Margaret's lawsuit was wrapping up. The trust wasn't just worth a few million. It was worth $35 million. When Margaret found out, she lost what little grip on reality she had left. She added to the lawsuit, claiming the land deal had been hidden from her. The judge saw right through her, not only dismissing the case, but ordering her to pay James's legal fees. With no money left, Margaret was forced to sell her mansion. Her luxury cars were repossessed, her credit was destroyed. Then came the final nail in the coffin, the bank fraud investigation. When she stole the decoy box, she unknowingly committed a felony by forging Harold's signature on fake documents. Legal trouble now consumed her. One night, James received a call. There had been a break-in attempt at his grandfather's house, which now legally belonged to him. When he arrived, police were already there. Margaret stood in the driveway, screaming at the officers. "This is my father's house," she shrieked. When the officer turned to James, he simply pulled out the deed. "She has no right to anything." Margaret was arrested for trespassing and attempted burglary. That was the last James saw of her. With nothing left, she faded into obscurity, working odd jobs to survive. Meanwhile, James honored Harold's memory, investing wisely, donating to charities his grandfather loved, and ensuring their family was secure. Harold had played the long game. Margaret thought she had won, but in the end, she had only outsmarted herself. For a while, it seemed like Margaret had finally learned her lesson. After her arrest, she disappeared from high society, moving into a rundown apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix. The once glamorous woman who dripped in designer clothes now scraped by on whatever odd jobs she could find. She had lost her wealth, her reputation, and her power. But some people don't know when to quit. Even in her downfall, Margaret refused to take responsibility. Instead, she spun a new story, one where she was the victim, wronged by her own family. She started telling anyone who would listen that James had stolen her inheritance, that he had manipulated Harold into cutting her out. At first, James ignored it. Everyone who mattered knew the truth. But Margaret didn't stop. Then she crossed the line. One evening, James got another call from a real estate agent handling Harold's old estate. Someone had been making inquiries about the property, asking if there was a way to challenge the ownership. James knew exactly who it was. Margaret had no legal claim, but she was desperate. She wanted back in. Then it escalated. James woke up one morning to find his car vandalized, keyed from end to end, tires slashed. A few days later, a lawyer reached out. Margaret had filed yet another lawsuit, this time alleging that Harold had been mentally unfit when he signed his final will. She wanted everything reopened, dragging the case back to court. James was furious. He had moved on, built a life for himself, honored his grandfather's wishes. But Margaret? She couldn't accept the truth. And so, reluctantly, he prepared for one last battle. This time, though, Margaret wasn't just fighting James. She was fighting time, money, and the consequences of her own actions. And she was about to lose more than she ever imagined. Margaret's final lawsuit was doomed from the start. The evidence was airtight. Harold had been of sound mind, his legal documents meticulously prepared, his intentions crystal clear. But that didn't stop her from dragging it out for months, clinging to the hope that she could somehow reverse her fate. The problem? Lawsuits cost money, and Margaret had none. With no assets left to sell and no wealthy husband to bail her out, she resorted to desperate measures. She borrowed money from shady lenders, promising a payout she could never deliver. She begged old friends for loans, spinning sob stories about how her family had betrayed her. But no one was fooled anymore. Margaret had burned every bridge. Then the inevitable happened. The court not only ruled against her, but sanctioned her for wasting the court's time. On top of that, she was ordered to pay even more legal fees. The final blow came when the lenders she had borrowed from started demanding repayment immediately. And these weren't the kind of people who took no for an answer. Margaret vanished after that. No one knew exactly where she went, but word spread that she had skipped town, dodging creditors and running from the mess she had created. Some said she was hiding in a dingy motel in El Paso, working odd jobs under a fake name. Others claimed she had fled the country, trying to start over somewhere new. Her reign of greed and entitlement over for good. James, on the other hand, thrived. He built on the wealth Harold had left him, not just hoarding it, but using it wisely, investing, giving back, securing a future for his family. And every now and then he would think about Margaret, how she had spent her whole life scheming, manipulating, taking, only to end up with nothing. His grandfather had seen her for who she was and had played the long game. In the end, Margaret hadn't just lost, she had destroyed herself. Harold had the last laugh. And James? He never looked back. Years passed, and Margaret became nothing more than a cautionary tale, a whispered story among distant relatives, a lesson in greed and self-destruction. No one knew exactly where she was. Some believed she had settled in a small border town, taking cash jobs to avoid being tracked. Others heard rumors that she was working under an alias, trying to con her way back to a comfortable life. But for all her scheming, Margaret never regained the wealth and status she once flaunted. James, on the other hand, continued to honor Harold's legacy. He expanded his investments, donated to causes his grandfather had cared about, and in short, his father, Thomas, lived comfortably in his later years. Life had given James everything Margaret had tried to steal, yet he had earned it through patience and integrity, not manipulation. Then one evening, an unexpected email arrived. It was from an old acquaintance of Margaret's, someone she had once called a friend back in her socialite days. The message was short. You should know Margaret is in trouble, real trouble. James hesitated before replying. Did he even want to know? Was she worth another second of his time? Against his better judgment, he responded, asking for details. What he received was a story that was both predictable and tragic. Margaret had finally hit rock bottom. The people she had borrowed from, the kind who didn't forget debts, had caught up to her. With nowhere left to run, She was living in a rundown motel outside San Antonio, barely surviving. Worse, she was sick. Years of stress, poor choices, and heavy drinking had taken a toll. She had no insurance, no savings, and no one left to turn to. The woman who had once worn diamonds and silk was now just another forgotten soul, scraping by in a world that had moved on without her. For the first time in years, James felt something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction, but something close to pity. Margaret had done this to herself, but that didn't make it any less tragic. The question was, what, if anything, should he do about it? James sat with the email open for a long time. He had every reason to ignore it. Margaret had lied, stolen, and tried to destroy him at every turn. She had shown no remorse, no gratitude, no kindness. Helping her now wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't undo the years of betrayal. And yet, as much as he wanted to let her fade into obscurity, something in him wouldn't let it go. Harold had always believed in doing what was right, not what was easy. He had raised James to be better than the people who wronged him. And despite everything, despite the lawsuits, the manipulation, and the outright theft, Margaret was still family. The next morning, James made a call to his lawyer, Mr. Callahan. "Find out if she's really in trouble," he said, "and if she is, see what can be done." A week later, Callahan had the full report. Margaret was, indeed, in a desperate situation. She was sick, liver disease, likely from years of drinking. She was behind on rent at the motel and barely had enough money to eat. The people she owed money to were closing in. It was only a matter of time before she ended up either homeless or worse. James wasn't about to give her a second chance at life. She had squandered too many already. But he couldn't let her die in the gutter either. Through a third party, he arranged for her medical bills to be covered and for a small monthly stipend to be sent. Just enough to keep her off the streets, but not enough for her to return to her old ways. She would never know it came from him, and that was the end of it. James never spoke to her again, never checked in, never looked back. Margaret spent her final years alone, a shadow of the woman she had once been, while James thrived, surrounded by family and success. His grandfather had won the long game, and in the end, so had he. Harold always said that some people never learn. Margaret had proved him right. Years passed, and Margaret faded into a distant memory. No one spoke of her anymore, not at family gatherings, not even in hushed whispers. Life moved forward, and James built a future far removed from the chaos she had once brought into his life. He married, had children, and carried on Harold's legacy with integrity, expanding his investments, supporting charities, and ensuring his family's wealth was never wasted on greed or foolishness. Then, one morning, James received a phone call. It was from a hospital in Austin. The voice on the other end was matter of fact. "Mr. Lancaster, we're calling regarding Margaret Davenport. She passed away last night." For a moment, James said nothing. He had known this day would come, but now that it had, he wasn't sure how he felt. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no relief, just an odd sense of finality. "Was she alone?" he finally asked. "Yes," the nurse replied gently. "She had no listed next of kin, no visitors, no contacts." James closed his eyes. That was exactly how Margaret's life had ended. Alone, forgotten, the way she had written her own story. For all her scheming, all her desperate attempts to take everything for herself, she had lost the one thing money could never buy: family. The hospital asked if he wanted to claim the body, to make funeral arrangements. Technically, he didn't have to. The state would take care of it, a quiet cremation with no ceremony. And maybe that was what she deserved. But James wasn't like her. He wouldn't let her be discarded like an afterthought, no matter what she had done. "Yes," he finally said, "I'll handle it." He didn't do it for her, he did it for Harold, for the values his grandfather had instilled in him. Margaret had made her choices, but James would make his. And his choice was to close this chapter with dignity, even if she never had the grace to do the same. The funeral was small, quiet, and unremarkable. No flowers, no long eulogies, no mourners other than James and a few distant relatives who showed up more out of obligation than grief. There was no outpouring of sorrow, no tearful goodbyes, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees at the simple cemetery in Hillcrest, just outside of Austin. James stood near the modest gravestone, hands in his pockets, staring at the name engraved on it. Margaret Davenport, 195822024. No beloved mother, no cherished sister, no kind words etched in stone. just a name and the years that had defined her time on Earth. He thought about what Harold would have said if he were here. Maybe he would have shaken his head, let out that knowing chuckle, and muttered, "Some people never learn." As the service concluded, one of the distant relatives, a woman James barely recognized, approached him. "It's good of you to do this," she said. "Most wouldn't have." James shrugged. It wasn't about her. The woman nodded as if she understood, but James doubted she really did. This wasn't about forgiveness. Margaret had spent her life taking and manipulating, and she had reaped exactly what she had sown. This wasn't about redemption either. Margaret had never apologized, never admitted fault, never shown an ounce of remorse. No, this was about something bigger. It was about closing the door on a part of his life that had once been filled with resentment and anger. It was about ensuring that Harold's legacy, the real one, the one built on wisdom, patience, and integrity, remained untarnished. As James turned to leave, he took one last look at the grave. Margaret had thought she was the smartest person in the room. She had spent her entire life chasing wealth and power, convinced she could outmaneuver fate itself. But in the end, she had outsmarted no one but herself. She had outsmarted no one but herself. And she hated all of it. But James walked away without a second glance. The past was finally buried, and the future was his. Margaret's story isn't just about greed, it's about choices. She believed she could take shortcuts, manipulate her way to the top, and always come out ahead. But life doesn't work that way. In the end, she didn't just lose her fortune, she lost everything that truly mattered. Meanwhile, James proved that integrity, patience, and doing the right thing will always win in the long run. His grandfather knew it, and in the end, so did he. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories about life, family, and the unexpected twists that come with them. There's always another lesson to be learned, and you won't want to miss it. See you in the next video.